Welcome to our unit on poetry. You can use the Introduction to Poetry Notes Guide to follow along. You'll be allowed to use the slides and your notes as you complete the Introduction to Poetry review form. Each of you has already defined poetry. Let's look at how some of the greatest poets in the world have defined it. Every published or aspiring poet has written an Ars Poetica. An Ars Poetica is a poem about the art of poetry. One important detail to remember about poetry is that it does not need to rhyme. As a matter of fact, modern poetry very rarely rhymes, except maybe in rap music. Modern poetry is really about choosing the best and fewest words and putting them in the perfect order to show something in a new and interesting way, where people will say, "Wow, yes, that." Poetry does not need to follow the rules of grammar. It manipulates language to make meaning. What do I mean when I say manipulates language? Well, it alters our perception. It changes the way we understand and process and think about words. Poetry doesn't use any empty words. It creates imagery, it appeals to the five senses, it uses figurative language, metaphors, similes, personification, and it doesn't use filler and connecting words to make complete sentences like prose does. Poetry is not always telling a story, but sometimes it can. When it does, it's called narrative poetry. The goal of poetry is not to create a riddle or to make it difficult for you to understand the purpose. Quite the opposite, actually. Poetry intends to create intense meaning. It observes the obvious and then shows it back to us in a way we hadn't realized, but now we completely understand. Poetry, like art, attempts to capture one perspective of the truth that is universal. Poetry requires us to think, and in that thinking, we connect more wholly with the world. You already know this is true. It's why we love music so much. Music does the same thing. We'll look at a variety of poetry. Some, like sonnets from the Renaissance, will rely on rhyme scheme to create their meaning. In this case, rhyme is very necessary, but it's measured and deliberate. And as a side note on poetry, when you're writing about it, remember always to put the title of a poem in quotation marks, because it's the title of a short work of literature. You do not need to put the title in quotes when it's your own poetry and your own title. I've already mentioned Ars Poetica. Well, the first recorded Ars Poetica was written by Horace over 2,040 years ago, between 20 and 13 years BC. His Ars Poetica illustrated the conventions or criteria of poetry to highlight knowledge, social grace, and sincerity. Poetry still does all of this today. The key to all poetry is authenticity. When you are writing poetry, it is very important to tell the truth. Allow your words to betray you. If you don't like poetry, then maybe your Ars Poetica will be about not liking poetry. The purpose of poetry is quite simple. It's to capture universal themes and experiences and wrap them in original but accessible thoughts. Authentic beauty is the highest virtue, and poetry aspires to that. That means it is a unique way of saying what we see, but a way in which we understand it more deeply. Theme is the lesson about life or statement about human nature that a poem is trying to express. To determine theme, start by figuring out the main idea. Then keep looking around the poem for some details that will support it, like the structure or syntax, the sounds or images, the word choice, or any other poetic devices. You have heard me say this before. Observation is the key to intellect. The smartest people in the world are the observant ones, the comedians, the scientists, the poets. We observe because it helps us to understand the world around us more clearly. The more we notice, the better we understand. Great minds observe the world and the details in it, and then they report it back to us. Poets do it using the power of language. Let's review our literary devices and techniques because we're going to see them in our poetry. First, attention to detail. Not only is attention to detail important in making sure we're using language correctly, it harnesses the full power of observation, what we are noticing in the world around us. Imagery appeals to the five senses. It's language that we can see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. Figures of speech use language in comparative ways to make meaning. Metaphor compares two unlike things. All language is metaphor. Simile is a comparison of two unlike things using the words like or as. Personification gives human qualities to something that is not human. A symbol is an object or idea that represents something intangible. Allusion, you might remember this from our mythology unit, is any reference to history, literature, or religion that people will recognize and make associative meaning with. The most three commonly alluded to things are mythology, Shakespeare, and the Bible. Diction is very simply word choice, the precise words the poet chooses to use. Rhyme is a predictable pattern of sound. Stanza is a group of lines in a poem, like a paragraph in prose. When talking about poetry, we identify those paragraph-like sections as stanzas. Syntax is just a fancy word for structure or the order of the words in a line or phrase or even a sentence. A sonnet is a very measured poem. It uses a very specific rhyme scheme and a beat pattern, and a sonnet is usually 14 lines. Free verse is poetry that does not have specific meter or rhyme. Most modern poetry is free verse. And all poetry uses the economy of words, the fewest and most accurate words possible to make the best meaning. We're going to use an acronym called DIDDLES to analyze our poetry. How do we analyze poetry? Well, we're looking for tone, and the key to finding tone is to analyze the language and discover, how does this poem make me feel? So DIDDLES helps us to figure out, what are we looking for? What patterns do we see? And how do these patterns create meaning? The acronym for DIDDLES is listed over here. The D stands for diction, I stands for imagery, D stands for details, L stands for language, specifically figurative language, and S stands for syntax.